Hello, dear learners. Welcome to the MOOC on Rural Development in India. In this unit, we will discuss about climate change and rural vulnerabilities. So, at the very beginning, let us have a concept of climate change and its scientific basis. When we say about climate change, it is very important to differentiate between weather and climates. So, what is weather? Weather basically represents short-term atmospheric conditions, while climate refers to the average pattern of weather observed over a long period of time. So, scientifically, climate is defined based on the analysis of weather data over a minimum period of 30 years. And these standards ensures that climate assessment captures long-term trends rather than short-term variability. Say, for example, a single year of drought or heavy rainfall cannot be considered climate change. However, a consistent pattern of declining rainfall or rising temperature over several decades indicates a shift in climate. So, in contemporary time, the primary driver of climate change is the increase in greenhouse gas emission that is resulted from human activity such as industrialization, deforestation, and fossil fuel consumptions. So these gases, what happen, trap heat in the atmosphere, and thus it leads to global warming. And the consequences include rising global temperature, melting glaciers, sea level rise, and increased frequency of extreme weather events. So this is all about the climate, what is climate change and what is its consequences. Now, in the Indian context, climate change manifests through rising temperature, erratic monsoons, and increased climatic variability. And these changes have significant implication for the rural livelihood because they are directly affect natural resources and agricultural system. So now let us look into the relationship between the climate change and what is its impact on rural areas. So what happened? Basically, rural areas are importantly linked to the climate system because their livelihoods depend directly on natural resources. Agriculture, which form the mainstay of rural economies, is highly sensitive to the climatic conditions. Even minor changes in temperature or rainfall can significantly affect crop productivity, soil fertility, as well as availability of water. So in India, a large proportion of agriculture is basically rain-fed, which makes it particularly vulnerable to climate variability. Delayed monsoon can disrupt sowing cycles, while excessive rainfall can damage crops and cause soil erosions. In other hand, prolonged dry spells reduce soil moisture as well as it leads to the crop failure. And thus it affect both food security and the income levels of rural households. So these are all about the agriculture, but beyond agriculture, rural households also rely on forest, water bodies, and grazing land, and thus the climate change affect this ecosystem by altering biodiversity, reducing forest cover, as well as affecting the water availability. For instance, forest dependent communities in northeast India, including Assam, rely heavily on non-timber forest product. We have already discussed this in the earlier sessions. So these changes in rainfall and temperature affect the forest regeneration and thereby it impact the rural livelihoods. The interconnected nature of rural livelihood means that climate change has cascading effect. So a decline in agricultural productivity leads to reduced income, which in turn affect the food consumption, education, and health outcomes. And thus it creates a cycle of vulnerability that is difficult to escape. Now let us see the global impact of climate change on rural livelihood. So at the global level, climate change has had profound impact on rural communities, particularly in developing regions. The main concern is the rising temperature and changing pattern of precipitation, that is rainfall, and these have reduced agricultural productivity and increased the risk of food security. Extreme weather events such as drought, floods, and hurricanes have become more frequent and severe, which causes significant economic losses in various countries. Livestock systems are affected by changes in the grazing pattern and increased disease prevalence, while fisheries are impacted by ocean warming and acidification. Climate change has also exacerbated rural poverty and inequality. Vulnerable groups, including smallholder farmers, indigenous community, they are disproportionately affected due to limited access to resources and adaptive capacity. Migration has emerged as a common coping strategy, with rural population moving in urban area in search of alternative livelihood. Now let us see the climate change and in the context of rural India. So we have already discussed in the contemporary era of rapid globalization, the economic growth has often progressed at the expense of environmental sustainability and climate resilience. And this imbalance has placed rural India at a critical crossroad, and it becomes important to balance between development with ecological stability. So climate change as a multidimensional phenomenon has emerged a major disruptive force that is redesigning rural livelihood, particularly in agrarian economies. Rural India remains highly dependent on climate sensitive sector. We have already discussed such as agriculture, livestock rearing, fisheries and forestry. So nearly 50% of the population derives its livelihood directly or indirectly from agriculture and allied activities, and thus it makes it particularly vulnerable to climate variability. Earlier we noticed that the seasonal cycle, such as whenever it is summer or monsoon, that followed relatively predictable patterns. However, now it becomes increasingly erratic, exposing rural communities to the frequent externality or shocks. So, over the past 2 decades, India has witnessed significant changes in its climatic conditions. So, as per the IPCC 2022 report, the average surface temperature has increased by approximately 0.7 degree centigrade between 1901 and 2018, with a projection indicating a rise of 1.6 degrees centigrade to 2.5 degrees centigrade by the mid 21st century. So, rainfall patterns have also become highly unpredictable, which is characterized by delayed monsoon, unseasonal rainfall, and prolonged dry spell. So, this variability is particularly concerning given that more than 60% of India's cultivated land is rainfed, and thus it makes agricultural production highly sensitive to climatic fluctuations. So, these changes are not a projections, these are already unfolding in rural time, and thus it intensify the vulnerabilities of rural population to climate related changes. Small and marginal farmers, landless laborers, forest dependent communities and rural women faces the greatest risks due to the limited access to resources, institutional support and adaptive technology. So climate change therefore not only affect environmental condition, but it also exacerbates socio-economic inequalities. The southwest monsoon, which contributes over 70% of India's annual rainfall, has become less reliable. Variation in monsoon onset, intensity, distribution have become common, disrupting the traditional agricultural practices. So what happened? Farmers now face uncertainty in planning cropping cycle, and thus it leads to increased risks of crop failure. Another disparity is regional disparity, which highlight the uneven impact of climate change. We can cite some examples such as states like Maharashtra, Telangana are experiencing chronic droughts, while regions like Assam and Bihar face recurrent flooding. The frequency of extreme weather events has increased significantly. So between 2000 and 2019, India experienced more than 250 extreme events, including cyclone, floods, and heat waves. Cyclone like Amphan in 2020, which affected over 30 million people and caused agricultural losses that exceed $14 billions, which illustrate the scale of climate-related disruption. This is as per the IPCC report 2022. Now come to the vulnerability of rural population to this climate change. So first, let us know what is vulnerability. Commonly used definition is that of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that is IPCC, which defines vulnerability as the degree to which a system, a community, or individual is susceptible to and unable to cope with the adverse effect of external stresses such as climate change. It reflects a combination of three key elements. The first one is exposure to risk, such as exposure to floods or droughts. Then sensitivity to those risks, that is dependence on climate sensitive resources. And the third one is adaptive capacity, that is the ability to cope or recover. So in the context of rural livelihoods, vulnerability implies the extent to which rural households are likely to experience harm due to climatic variability or variations, given their dependence on, because they are dependent on natural resources, limited economic resilience, as well as restricted access to institutional support system. So we can say that rural populations are particularly vulnerable to climate change due to the combined influence of environmental, economic, institutional, and social factors. So this vulnerability is rooted in the dependence of rural livelihood on natural resources, which are highly sensitive to climatic variation. We have already mentioned that agriculture, forestry, water resources, which actually form the backbone of rural economies, are directly affected by changes in temperature, rainfall, and frequency of extreme weather event. And as a result, even minor climatic shift can significantly disrupt livelihood system and threaten the food security. Regarding the economic constraint, which further intensify this vulnerability, a large proportion of rural households operate at or near subsistence level with limited savings and inadequate access to formal credit systems. So this restricts their capacity to invest in adaptive measures such as irrigation, infrastructure, improved crop variety, and climate resilient technology. A report in the year 2024 by Down to Earth, which actually estimates that the climate related disruption, including heat stress, erratic rainfall, and flooding, can reduce the annual income of the rural poor in India by up to 5%. Another one is the institutional limitation, which also play a critical role in shaping vulnerability in rural areas. Rural areas are often lack access to timely weather information, agricultural extension services, and efficient market systems. So inadequate infrastructure such as poor roads, limited irrigation facility, and weak disaster management systems have been further constrained the ability of rural communities to cope with and recover from climate reduced shocks. And these structural deficiencies reduce resilience and prolong the recovery period for the following climatic event. Now, the vulnerability is, you can see the vulnerability in different groups. So, let us first see it in among marginalized groups. So, within rural population, vulnerability is not uniform but is shaped by existing social inequalities. So, marginal farmers, landless laborers, and social disadvantaged groups many times have limited access to productive resources, institutional support, and decision-making processes. This unequal distribution of resources increase their exposure to climate risk and significantly reduces their adaptive capacity. Another is gender dimensions, which is more pronounced in rural India. So what happened? Women disproportionately bear the burden of climate change impact due to their structural inequalities, such as limited land ownership, restricted access to credit, and exclusions from local governance institutions. So these constraints limit their ability to respond effectively to the climate-related stresses. Under condition of environmental stress and resource scarcity, the workload of rural women also increased substantially. They are primarily responsible for ensuring household, food, and water security, while also contributing as unpaid or low-paid laborers in agricultural activities. So, as per a recent report, which basically highlighted a stark example from Dindori village in Madhya Pradesh, where women were forced to descend into a nearly depleted 30-foot deep well to collect the last available water. And such instances illustrate the severe physical and emotional strain imposed by climate-induced resource scarcity over women. Now, let us discuss the region-specific disparities in vulnerability in India. So, vulnerability to climate change is not uniform across regions in India. Rather, it varies significantly depending on ecological conditions, socio-economic structure, and the level of institutional development. In India, these disparities are particularly evident due to the country's diverse agroclimatic zone and uneven patterns of development. Say, for example, the impact of climate change are particularly severe in ecologically fragile regions such as the Indian Himalayan region, including Uttarakhand. The severity of climate-induced disaster in this region is evident from events such as the 2013 Uttarakhand flood, which caused wider space destruction. Within a short period of time and rainfall, approximately 4,200 villages were affected and over 11,000 livestock were lost and thousands of homes were destroyed. So such disaster demonstrate the scale of vulnerability and the devastating consequences of climate variability. In Madhya Pradesh, indigenous communities that depend heavily on small-scale rail-fed agriculture and non-timber forest products are particularly vulnerable to erratic rainfall and deforestation. Weak village-level institutions have further contributed to forest degradation and unsustainable resource uses. In West Bengal, where agriculture is largely rain-fed, climate variability, especially in flood-prone regions, poses significant risks to the livelihoods. Diversification of livelihood systems has emerged as an effective adaptation strategy. The introduction of integrated farming system, combining multiple crops with livestock, poultry, nutrition gardens, and fisheries has significantly enhanced resilience. Such diversification has resulted in income increase ranging from 70 to 100% among beneficiary households, which demonstrate the effective of integrated production systems. Similarly, in the Ganga Delta region, rural populations are highly exposed to cyclones and saltwater intrusion, which adversely affect agricultural productivity. The adoption of salt-tolerant paddy varieties and promotion of fish cultivation have proven to be successful adaptation measures. Another example is in coastal Tamil Nadu, communities are particularly vulnerable due to their dependence on fishery and paddy cultivation, which coupled with high exposure to cyclone, flood, sea level rise, and salinization of land and groundwater. The introduction of integrated mangrove and fish farming system has improved dual benefits of ecological protection and livelihood enhancement. The Gulf of Mannar, located along the southeastern coast of Tamil Nadu, represent another important case where climate and human-induced stresses have affected coral reef ecosystem and associated fisheries. Rising sea surface temperature and destructive practices such as coral mining have degraded marine resources. In semi-arid Rajasthan, livestock rearing is a crucial component of rural livelihoods. However, increasing variabilities in rainfall, characterized by prolonged drought followed by intense rainfall event, has led to soil erosion and degradation of pasture lands. And this has reduced the availability of fodder for livestock. Integrated pasture management practices have helped address the challenges by improving fodder availability by nearly 70% and thereby supporting livestock-based livelihood. Another major challenges we can cite example in case of Rajasthan, where the movement of sand dunes in the third desert, which causes significant damage to agricultural land and infrastructure. So, another major challenges in Rajasthan is the movement of sand dunes in the third desert, and this causes significant damage to agricultural land and infrastructure. So, these are some examples which collectively demonstrate the vulnerability according to different areas of the same country, that is India, and some of the adaptive measures to cope with that climate risks and vulnerabilities. So now come to the policy perspective on climate vulnerability. Rural India urgently requires well-designed adaptive strategy to build climate resilience by addressing both structural weakness and localized community needs. So one of the institutional response in this direction is the National Mission for Sustainable Agriculture, which promote climate smart agriculture practices such as crop diversification, agroforestry, precision irrigation, and the use of drought resistant seed variety. At the same time, financial inclusion forms a critical pillar in climate resilience. Rural households needs improved access to crop insurance, affordable credit, as well as microfinance services so that they can better absorb climate shocks and invest in long-term adaptive measures. Although schemes like the Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana were introduced with the objective, their effectiveness has become constrained by low awareness among farmers, procedural complexity, and delays in claim settlement. So, therefore, addressing these implementation gaps is essential to ensure that such schemes reach the most vulnerable population of rural India. Equally important is the strengthening of community-based natural resource management. Experiences from states such as Odisha, Madhya Pradesh, and Rajasthan demonstrate the empowering local institutions, particularly Gram Panchayat, self-help groups, which can lead to more sustainable governance of water resources, forest, and grazing lands. So, these decentralized approaches not only enhance ecological sustainability but also build collective resilience at the grassroots level. Furthermore, climate adaptation strategy must be explicitly gender inclusive. Women in rural areas play a central role in agriculture, water collection, as well as household food security. Yet, they often remain excluded from decision-making processes and they lack access to extension services and other services. So, integrating women into climate action planning, improving their access to resource and training, and formally recognizing their unpaid care work within policy framework are essential steps toward equitable resilience. Initiatives like the Mahila Kisan Sashактikaran Pariyojana provide an important model for empowering women farmers, but they require greater financial support and wider implementation to achieve meaningful and lasting impact. So with this, I come to the end of today's lecture. Thank you.